Hi everybody, this is Alec with Home and Rehab, and today I want to take you guys through the introduction to Tai Chi. So, before we get started on anything actually directly related to Tai Chi, what I wanted to start with is an introduction to what we'll be doing. So, first let's start off with what is Tai Chi. Tai Chi refers to Tai Chi Chuan. It's a shorthand term that we use in the United States for Tai Chi Chuan, which is a type of martial art practiced primarily in China where it originated. Now, Tai Chi Chuan is slightly different than Kung Fu and Wushu, which are derived in terms of martial arts from a similar region of the world, but practiced slightly differently. So, one of the things that we will be doing today is establishing what we're doing specifically. Now, Tai Chi Chuan is, while a martial art, best known specifically for a very specific type of practice. And before we get started, I guess you guys will meet my cat. This is Tristan. He's going to be probably joining us for a lot of these videos because he loves to be part of what I do. Yeah, buddy. So, everybody say hi to Tristan. Where was I? So, when we think of Tai Chi Chuan, we very specifically think of a style of practice that they do. Particularly, what they like to emphasize in a lot of the different forms of Tai Chi is a very, very slow form of practice that is attempting to perfect the movements that you're doing. I'm sorry, the camera's about to shake because the cat is currently rubbing the tripod. So, they're best known for a slow form of practice that attempts to perfect technique, meaning that we're trying to find exactly where our balance point is, how we're supposed to be positioning our feet, our shoulders, our posture, and our hands in order to improve our awareness of how we're moving. As we practice that movement slowly, over and over and over again, one of the things we're trying to do is build muscle memory. That's a term that we use very often in sports medicine to more accurately refer to what's known as cerebellar memory. That means the area of your brain that is able to produce movement without us consciously having to think about it. One of the things that we emphasize when we're talking about cerebellar learning, that ability to repeat over and over and over again in order to make sure that you're doing it correctly, is making sure that you do it slowly over time, very, very, very many repetitions. So we talk about the phrase, 1,000 repetitions makes a master, and that's actually relatively true. Our research into how this all works actually finds that we tend to actually need at least 1,000 repetitions of an activity to do it perfectly if we do it at one time without having to think about it. So, what we use this to our advantage of in physical therapy is taking that repetitive technique and using it to make sure that we're learning how to place our body in movements that make sense. So, when Tai Chi Chuan refers to the martial art, they're referring to a very, very particular style of martial art. Most often when you think of it in the United States, you think of something known as yang form. What we're going to be doing here is actually based off of some of my previous martial arts training, trying to take movements that more directly apply to physical therapy. This is based off of the Tai Chi Fundamentals course that I took back in my university days. And what we were doing at that time was participating in a course that took Tai Chi as a martial art and tried to apply it directly into physical therapy. What I've done here is I've actually created some forms that are more explicitly taken from other martial arts, using these same base principles of Tai Chi in order to distill it down into something that we can use for fitness and for overall health. When we're doing these forms, we are not explicitly doing Yang form Tai Chi, which is what most people are going to associate with when they hear Tai Chi. We will be practicing movements taken from martial arts in order to use those movements and advance our own body's ability to perform its daily functions. The very specific thing that I try to do with any exercise that I'm doing as a physical therapist. So what we'll be doing today is learning some of the basic movements, how we tend to take our movements and apply them in martial arts, so that you guys can then apply them into the forms as we start to grow them. So today we're going to be learning some of the basic forms that make up the first form that I've created for this martial art. This is still termed Tai Chi here because it's what most people are going to associate it with. So while this is not explicitly Yang form Tai Chi, what we are doing is something in that same mindset. So we're going to keep using that term very simply because it's going to be the most complete term that actually affects what we're doing. When we first start with any martial art, one of the things that we start with is our base stance and our footwork. So there are a lot of different stances that people will associate with martial arts, especially if they've seen a lot of movies. One of the most common ones that you'll see is horse stance. We also know this as riding stance. What we are trying to do is very, very simply keeping a relatively erect posture, sit slightly back over like we're trying to initiate the movement of sitting down into a chair. This does a couple of different things when we're doing martial arts, but most importantly what it allows us to do is have a base movement that allows us to be relatively evenly weighted. The reason we're using this in physical therapy is because it allows me to have a better sense of where my feet are over the ground. I can very, very easily pay attention to what I'm doing here. Where is the weight over my toes versus my heels? Am I leaning off to one side or the other? I should feel relatively even in all those points. I should feel like my heels and toes have even amounts of weight. I should feel like my hips are evenly distributed from side to side. I have a soft knee flexion here. This serves a couple different purposes. Number one, that soft knee and hip flexion actually activates both my quadriceps and my hamstrings and glutes, which allows me to have just a generic isometric exercise as I'm doing any sort of upper body activity. That allows me to have a standard amount of strength, which is necessary for when we're walking and moving around. When we're actually upright in a more full erect posture, these muscles are actually on a little bit more slack. So we found that by having this slight isometric activation here, we're challenging these muscles in a slightly new way, allowing them to build up their endurance in just a base horse stance. Where we're going to start with our hands is very simply, if you were to hold your palms up like you're holding a tray, you're going to keep them in that same position and draw them gently straight backwards. My elbows should be straight out. I'm trying not to wing. I'm trying not to wing the other direction, but I have everything in a nice line. When I'm looking at where my palms are, they're resting right on the hip bones. So if you look at me from the side, you should feel like you could probably slide a dowel between my elbows. This basic riding stance is a good starting point for learning a lot of our base techniques, so it's what we're going to be doing today. However, we're going to relax our shoulders first because what I want you guys to first understand is our base footwork. So what we'll be doing is starting in this horse stance and working very simply on changing from one direction to the other. What I'm going to try to do is shift my weight over one side, the opposite leg. So if I'm shifting to my own left, my right leg is now going to turn out 90 degrees, so my toes are now pointing my target. I'm then going to set my foot down and redistribute my weight, so I am now back to a 50-50 stance. When I want to change back to go forward, I'm going to re-weight onto that accepting leg, turn my right toes back forward, and come back to the center. For those of you wondering where my feet are, you'll sometimes see people encourage a squat with toes exactly pointed forward. Other people encourage them 45 degrees out to the side. What we encourage generally in martial arts is to find a comfortable position. Not toes pointed directly forward, not directly out to the side, but somewhere in the middle where it's nice and comfortable. So as we take this stance, I'm slightly bladed out in the back. My front toes are pointed directly at my target, and then I resume accepting that weight. Coming back to the center, and coming back into that nice even distribution. If I'm going to face off in the opposite direction, I'm again going to move slightly off to one side, turn my toes, place the toes down, and come back to that 50-50 weight, where half my weight is off my front leg, half is off the back leg, before I put the majority of weight back here, and come back to center, bringing myself back to that 50-50. Our goal in general is to try and spend the majority of our time with 50% of our weight distributed over our feet when we're not actively moving. The reason we do this is very simply, it helps make sure that no part of our body is overworking. Sometimes when we see people come in for physical therapy, we'll actively see people spend too much time off to one hip. This is very common actually with mothers, especially if you have to hold your baby in your non-dominant side so you can do things throughout the day. This becomes a very comfortable position, but it spends a lot of time overworking one hip. What we're trying to do here is teach your body the awareness to try and spend more of its time nice and evenly distributed. The other thing we're doing as we're practicing this weight shift and back is make it easier for you to recognize where your body's weight is in space before moving a leg. This comes in very handy in martial arts. So if I'm practicing sword work, just happen to have one of these lying around. One of the things that I was taught in sword is if someone attacks your front leg, what you are very simply going to do is pick it up, set it down, and then attack with your own blade. While that doesn't come in very big context into daily life when you're thinking out of the base thought, what we do talk about a whole lot is if you step on something in your home and suddenly have to put all your weight on one side. If you happen to have kids with Legos, like my mother did when I was a kid, you may find those on accident once in a while. It's not a very pleasant experience. You're more likely to have a better time not falling if your body readily, as soon as it knows that it has to unweight this foot, automatically finds a way to put its weight back on the other leg. It's one of the things that we try to use transferring our balance ability into daily life, is making sure our body can readily make those quick weight shifts and steadily hold position. So it's one of the reasons you're going to find in this first form, we spend most of our time shift, come to center, shift, come to center, and coming back to 50-50, so that your body can get used to making that change necessary to have the other leg feel almost weightless. So as I'm making this turn off to one side, all of my weight can effectively be here, and this leg can kind of just dangle in space so it can find a good new position. The other thing this does for athletes is it helps me determine where a good position that is stable over this stance leg is. One of the mistakes that we see made very often when people are going into any activity is their stance leg is often at odd angles, and we think that this might be one of the major causes of high-risk injuries like ACL tears, MCL tears, and LCL tears. Some of the most dangerous and hard to recuperate from things that we can see depending on how your recovery goes. So one of the things we like to do is, of course, try to prevent it. And having good ability to distribute your weight evenly over a good stable point can be one of the best things we can do to make sure that we avoid these injuries. So that's where a lot of this stuff will come in very, very useful to people, is daily injury prevention. Now the other thing that this is important for is, of course, making sure that as we're having this nice weight distribution, we can also take that into our daily walking. Just making sure that as you're standing, we don't see what we call Trendelenburg gait pattern. One of the things that we think might cause some of the pain in people's hips is accepting too much weight too far over and not keeping our pelvis very level. It's easier to maintain a neutral pelvis than it is correct from a drop pelvis over and over and over every time we walk. And that drop that you see sometimes with people as things start to get weak, and that compensatory pattern that forces them to lean, can sometimes cause pain in the lateral hips and in the spine. So, as we start to practice this movement, working on maintaining a nice neutral position also gives us that isometric load into our hips, ideally, hopefully, helping prevent some of these issues. So what we're going to start with today is just that base idea of changing our weight. It's called basing bear in some forms, and what I'm doing is I'm shifting my weight over to one direction, letting my arms just very, very loosely come with me. This is one of the most base warm-ups you'll see in a lot of martial arts, and the idea is just to get used to making that weight foot change. The next thing I have people do is take back to the neutral stance, working on picking one leg up, stepping it back down into that same position, coming back through their horse stance, and coming up to the center. What we're trying to do here is just establish your body's sense of where its weight is in space. What we're trying to do as we're doing this is make it nice and steady as we come through this to go from that weight shift to the opposite side, so that you should feel a nice even transfer rate going from one leg to the other to make it as smooth as possible. That smoothness is, of course, aesthetically pleasing when you're watching someone perform their martial arts slowly, but the ability to do so is also an indicator of what we're trying to do. If we have good control, it should stay smooth. If you're losing control and having to do things quickly, it's an indicator that you don't have that. You might actually even need to slow down and spend more time concentrating on where your body is at any given point. The goal with this is to be mentally focused directly on what you are doing. This is a type of meditative martial art, as it's sometimes called, which means that you're goal is to be internally focused, spending majority of your time practicing, working on trying to perfect exactly what your body is doing, trying to let go of anything else that you might think about in lieu of trying to just concentrate exactly on what you are doing. Once we've gone through our repetitions and we have a good, steady stance that we're basing through, now we're going to go into our base turn. What you should be feeling is as you come through the center, as you set your toes down, you should bring yourself back to center again. Shift your weight over the accepting limb, let the other leg feel loose. 50-50. Acceptance back over the stance leg. Back to 50-50. Acceptance onto a new limb. Back to 50-50. Loading back to that same limb. And coming back to 50-50 in the center. What you should be feeling is that the majority of your time in this exercise is spent with your weight evenly distributed over your two limbs, smoothly rocking back and forth. Okay? That's the base form of what we're doing with our legs during the majority of Form 1 of this version of Tai Chi. The other thing I want to go through with you guys is your base types of blocks and your base types of strikes. The things that we're going to be adding into the form later that make it complete. So, when we start with our hands, what we're going to be doing is coming back to that nice neutral horse stance with our elbows behind us in a straight line, palms up, hands resting nicely around the site of your iliac crest, the top of your hip bone. What we're going to be learning first is called a low block. I'm actually going to start by bringing my hand up high. My palm should be staying up towards the ceiling as I bring it up to my shoulder. I am then going to brush my palm down. You should see that my palm is now facing my body and eventually rotating down to be right in front of my leg. If you see me do this from the side, again, you should see this come up, gonna come through rotation, and as my hand is out, it should be angled mostly towards the ground. I'm not flat over my leg, but I'm also not straight out in front. I'm at a nice soft angle here, trying to intercept something coming in from that side. So what we're going to do is just repeat from one side, bringing it back to neutral, bringing the other side up, across and down, and back to stance. This is, again, our low block. Now, depending on where you learn your martial art, who your instructor is, and a variety of different input they may have had in the past, you may see people do this same movement with a closed fist or with a more neutral, soft hand. When I'm teaching, I like to have people keep a relatively rigid hand, honestly, purely for aesthetics. The stuff we're learning right now is not particularly combat-based. While there are some martial arts that are specifically meant for self-defense, what we are practicing here is specifically designed more to focus on how we're moving our body. So, when I have people do this way, I'm allowing them to focus more on where their body is in a line. It looks aesthetically very nice, but also is allowing me to pay more attention to where my body is in space. Again, it should be like if I laid a plank down, I should have just a nice straight line down to the tips of my fingers. The next one we're going to do is called a middle block. If the low block block low, you can assume that this is going to block the center line of my body. The chamber for this, where we start the movement, is instead of coming to our opposite shoulder, we're going to come to the same side up to your head. My palm is now facing straight ahead of me. By the end of the movement, I'm going to bring that around until it's directly in front of my face. And then again, bring it back down. Up so the palm is facing straight ahead. My fingertips are touching the side of my temple. I'm going to bring it right in front of me so I can look at my palm. Again, from the side, you should see a relatively straight line here. And then I'm going to bring it back into my neutral stance. Up, through, and back. Being stared at by a cat from the ground, slightly impatient because I think he would rather be playing right now. The last block, we're going to do a high block. When we do a high block, we're now going to bring the hand to the opposite point on our waist. I'm almost cupping my hands off to the side. From here, palm up again, I'm going to bring my hands up in an arc so that it is above my head. This is assuming a strike is coming down from the top. What I'm trying to do here is go from, again, palm up to palm out, almost the inverse of this movement, coming from this cup and support to up high overhead. Bringing it back down, across, up overhead, and back down. The next thing we're going to go into is our strikes. How I would imagine hitting a person in this martial art. Just for the sake of variety, we're going to do a couple that we don't normally do in a lot of traditional martial arts once we move into the combat phase. But we are actually just going to practice them for the sake of practicing that body alignment, because some of these are movements that we would mimic in real life. And again, the camera's going to be shaking because the cat would like to distract me. Hi, buddy. We're going to start first with a palm heel strike. I am striking with the base of my palm. The idea is that it should be in a nice line with my shoulder. So as I throw this out, I'm going to throw it from here, bring it straight forward, and come back. What you'll be seeing as I do this is a slight rotation of my shoulder. I'm not doing a drastic movement driving this too far forward, just enough that my core will start to engage, but without trying to rotate the entirety of my hips for right now. As we progress further into some exercises, we will be doing some more drastic stances, but for right now, we're going to stay in these neutral stances we have. And so we want our body position to stay relatively neutral as we go through our palm heel strikes. You'll notice that my face is now more or less covered as I come through this line. Because if my opponent is directly in front of me, I would, of course, be striking him down the midline here. The next strike we're going to learn is called a spear hand. The base movement is going to be very similar, but instead of coming and bringing my palm out, I'm now going to be bringing my palm in towards the opposite side in a spear motion. Again, working on trying to find that nice line down the entirety of my arm. The last we're going to do is called a double hand push press, or a push press. What I'm going to do is start my hands low, bring them up, back to center, and imagine pushing someone right along the ridge line that forms your clavicle. So I'm bringing it up, gentle push, and out. Up, push, out. Up, push, out. Up, push, out. The goal of this should be a relatively circular motion. Should look nice and smooth, like I'm dragging my hands up from below. And they should follow nice and fluidly as I come around. What we're going to do now is put all of these into a very, very base rhythm. What we're going to do is every time I strike to one side, I'm going to turn, form a block, form a strike, and then repeat that same pattern to the opposite side, trying to work on our own symmetry. Then we're going to do a different block with a different strike, perform that same one with the opposite hands, the opposite direction, finishing with our final block and our final strike, our final block and our final strike. I'm going to talk you guys through it as we do it one time. I'm going to go extremely slowly, just like we would when we're practicing traditional Tai Chi. And then I'm going to do it once where you guys can just watch as we do it together, okay? You guys are more than welcome to participate along the first time, or you can watch and just see what I'm doing. However you learn, that's the right way to do this. When we start, we're going to start again in that horse stance, dropping in to neutral. I'm going to start by taking my left hand, bringing it up to prepare for a low block. Then I'm going to shift my weight to my right leg, turn to my left side, and as I come back to that neutral position, I'm going to shift my weight over the front leg, so I'm now again in 50-50. From here, my blocking hand's going to return to the center, and I'm going to push out. My toes are now in a lifted position. I have slightly more weight on my front foot, and that allowed me to propel myself into this palm heel strike. As I bring this back to center, my back toes and heels are now flat again in their normal position, bladed out. I'm going to come in, bring myself up, turn the opposite direction, perform that same low block, accepting my weight down into 50-50 here. I'm now going to bring my hand back to my hips, push onto my toes, and drive the palm outwards. As I bring this back, my heel has now touched the ground, my toes are bladed out again. I've come back to center. That was a low block and a palm heel strike. What we're going to do next is bring our hand up and prepare for our middle block to the opposite side. So my right hand is in the air, my weight is on my right leg, my left toes are currently in the air preparing to accept some weight. I'm now going to come back to my 50-50 and bring myself so I'm looking at my palm. From here, I'm going to drop actually and lift my heel on the ground, so I'm now facing both toes in this forward direction. I'm going to drop both hands back and put my weight over my back leg for a moment, propel back to my 50-50 stance slightly forward so my heel's just off the ground and back in my push press out. From here, I'm going to come back to my middle position, hand up, weight over the left, toes currently up. I'm now going to accept the weight into a 50-50 stance as I block. Toes are going to rise up in the back, so now both feet are pointing straight ahead of me. I'm going to come back onto my back leg for a moment, letting this leg be relatively weightless. Come back to accept 50-50. And lift my heel just off the ground to be slightly over 50-50 at the end of my push. Now I'm going to bring myself back to neutral into my horse stance. For the final block series, I'm going to turn as I bring my hand palm here to do a high block. Coming back to 50-50 as I bring myself into the block. My toes are going to cock so that, again, my heel is off the ground, ready to push me into my spear hand. And for decoration, this hand is going to come palm down right underneath, supporting the spear hand limb. Coming back through the center, my toes are now pointed directly at you. Shifting my weight over, preparing to turn. Bringing myself back to 50-50 with my right toes pointed forward and my right arm towards the sky. I'm now going to drop that right arm down, point my toes forward as I guide the spear hand over it, and come back to center. Traditionally in martial arts, we often begin with a type of show of respect. In different martial arts, it's called different things. In Muay Thai, which was one of the first martial arts I learned, it's called a Y, which very simply means a show of respect. The way we do this traditionally in Chinese martial arts is you make a fist with your right hand, take your left hand keeping it relatively straight, and you form a roof over it, pressing it gently towards whoever you're showing respect for. We'll often do this before and after a form out of tradition, and it's something I'm very used to, so I'd like to keep it involved. What we're going to do then is start before we've entered horse stance. I'm now in my nice neutral stance here. And before we begin, I'm going to bring my arms up and around. Come into my show of respect. Push it out. And drop back into my stance. From here, I'm not going to talk. I'm just going to let you guys watch as I'm doing. And if you'd like, play along. So that's the base form that we're going to be playing with over the first couple visits. So as we start this, I'm going to review again some of our basic strikes, our basic blocks at the beginning of our next video, and then we're going to spend more time working on making sure we're doing this as much as possible. I'll spend more time talking through the form a couple times through. I'm going to try and do this from a couple different angles next time so you again can see where I'm facing at different points in it from a variety of places. So that as we progress along with this, as you guys have a chance to perfect it, you can think about what I'm thinking about. Where am I thinking as I'm doing the different movements so you can pay attention to see if at home you're doing it correctly as well. All right? I've got a couple posts here. I just want to see what's going on. All right. Looks just like people waving and saying hello. So thank you guys very much for participating. I hope you learned something. And as we go along, we're going to try and build on this, adding more things into this form. And hopefully you guys are going to start paying a little bit closer attention to where your body is at and how you're using it. All right? Hope everyone has a great day, and we'll see you next week.